Welcome to the conversation, Race and Poetry in America at Brown University. My name is Brian Meeks from the Department of Africana Studies, Rights and Reason Theatre at Brown. For the second year running, the Office of the Provost and the Center for the Study of Race and Ethnicity in America are proud to present the Race and in America webinar series. Race and invites Brown scholars to investigate the origins, histories, and enduring contemporary effects of racism in America from a range of fields and scholarly perspectives. After reaching over 3,000 community members last year, the series expands and deepens in scope, both in thinking more comparatively about the roots and enduring effects of racism in the US and exploring the arts more fully in pursuit of a more just world. I want to thank my colleague and friend Tricia Rose, Provost Rick Locke, and the teams in the CSREA and the Provost's office who made this Race and in America series possible. I want to especially thank Tricia for the insight and vision that imagined the possibility of including poetry as part of this urgent conversation. It is a particular honor for me to be asked to host today's event, as at best, I consider myself a sometime poet, and I've been given the privilege to sit with and listen to the voices and thoughts of outstanding, real, full-time poets from our community. There's a time when the normal, prosaic, pedestrian pace of human life gathers momentum and long-winded prose is insufficient, just inadequate to capture the meaning of the times. It is then that poetry and the poetic voice, sweet as essential honey, sometimes distilled like aged rum, and even concentrated as nitroglycerin, emerge from the hidden cabinet and take center stage to explain how we got here, sketch the outlines of the conjuncture, and often draw the barest images of possible futures. Thus it was that since the brutal killing of George Floyd and the blossoming of the Black Lives Matter movement in the summer of 2020, there's been an efflorescence of seminars, conversations, institutional initiatives, articles and books, and inevitably poetry as an answer to the brutality of that moment and in support of the gathering forces, both national and global, against racism. The three poets and their work before us today, with their long histories of careful craftsmanship, cannot be understood as merely reflexive responses to 2020. Yet, we are holding this event a year later and under the title, Race and Poetry. So that is the underlying theme that binds us together. What is it that we write? Why do we write? And how does it speak to the moment? So let me introduce our speakers and explain how we will proceed. They are Colin Channer, Sawako Nakayasu, and Erica Hunt. Colin Channer is a Jamaican-born, New York-educated poet and novelist. He's been published in the New Yorker, Agni, Harvard Review, Conjunctions, and Britain's Poetry Review. His forthcoming book, Console, will be published by Farrar, Straus and Giroux in 2023. He is on the Brown faculty in the Department of Literary Arts. Sawako Nakayasu is also on the Brown Faculty of Literary Arts. She's an artist working with language, performance, and translation. Her books include Pink Waves, forthcoming Omnidawn, and Some Girls Walk into the Country They Are From, Wave Books. Erica Hunt is currently the Bonderman Visiting Professor of the Practice in the Literary Arts Department at Brown. She is the author of Jump the Clock, New and Selected Poems, Nightboat Books, and 5 acclaimed collections of poetry. Furthermore, detailed biographies of all 3 presenters are available in your chat links. Each will read a sample of their poetry and in turn speak a little bit about it and their work in general. After that, I look forward with great anticipation to an open discussion that will be accessible to all participants. That means the poets presenting, as well as you, the audience, through the Q&A function on your screen. Please feel free to input your questions in the Q&A at any time. I'm going to ask Colin to start us off, followed by Sawako, then Erica, without any further interventions from me. Colin, it's your turn.
Thank you, Brian, for the introduction, and thank you for everyone involved in organizing this event. I'm going to read a poem, and I think the poem sort of talks about itself. The poem is called Spumante, and it opens the new collection, Console. Weeks diffuse into each other like they're sprayed. Jetted, they shoot certain. Days, times, doodles, kept appointments. Next is lull, pool, fading, flash, disperse. I was shook and shocked by death. Chanced upon it on a winter walk. Proof of plod for miles behind me swept in fog. A wet so thick it blended with the snow that settled plenty on the sand. It was not yet daybreak, and I'd driven miles to walk and think, find peace in sweat and sea racket, that ancient, wise, asthmatic sound. The light took its lazy time for lifting. In the shift, I saw a darker shaping than the gray. At 2 miles, a boat of some proportion. At a 1/4 mile, a whale. Since then, I've been lamenting, moving as if held in gel. At night, I dream it. See it stretched across the rack of high tide, belly to the stars, flung shells and gravel, throat part grooved, fins unflappable, balletic flutes symmetric in their pointing, how they fused. All this in half-light, all this in sea dirge, wet air matte toned silver, and I hunched in the hood of my parka, God-awed before Shavasana, stilled as if the glassy eye that looked to me had fixed me in a century of tintype. Agape. I've only recently discovered love of animals, well, Killy, Nan, and Rebus, 3 dogs. Now I've partly taken leave of language, have given incoherent due. I know what it's like to be mammal filled with deepest ocean sounds. Oblivion, solitude, stillness intermitted by quake roar, tectonic slipping, lava fissures, ship propellers drilling, the human croons of whales. There is slave in me, fat heritage. No fluke, I'm invested with hurt, echo of the hunted, located, natural rights redacted, meagered to resource. All is flux as I'm collapsing love and distance, moving through the gel, my life, edging the canals of my city, clumping up its hills, memory, aerosol, head in self-cloud, getting Melville as I should have, watching at him contemplate the vista from a landlocked house, hills becoming pods of transmigrating giants, Greylock, Berkshire Range. There's thirst for music in this less than solid state, ampless back in my office, I knee prop my Fender, ancient black thing, strum it casual, weep. Suck salt in darkness, fingers guessy, lazing up the sound, still something brusque runs up me. Shuddered wood, that deep flesh shook that makes string music fuse to you. The thumbing further breaks the thing in me. I know what now love is. No tentative for sure, its incoherence, jelly analog is mine for life. The windows stay black and phlegmatic as the air outside begins to heave with rain. I hum, thumbing, fashion something of a home, some sucker, pulse quick but steady as I deep dive to dub. With it comes the baleen wheeze of mouth organs, plangent blue whoop. I am dub, and dub is water. Exile. I wish you could have lived in me, plunging, like spumante. I'd slip my hold on you like magma shot for islands every single time you breach. Came out of, the immediate incident was a whale carcass washing up on the beach in Charleston, Rhode Island, and I felt obligated to go and visit with it. There is something in the idea of terrestrial mammals feeling a need, in a poetic sense, to migrate, to leave and go into water just to have a life, right? And I remember going down there and looking at that whale and just bawling. On my way there, as I was driving, I was listening to Marley's album, Babylon by Bus. And there's a Marley song I really don't like that much, Jamming. You know, and maybe because it just seems like just a pop song. And I teach courses on Bob Marley. I know Bob Marley's music, but I never heard that song properly. And there's a line that says, every day we pay the price. We're the living sacrifice. And we keep moving on. And for me, it's about joy in the face of everything else, right? Can't surrender that joy. And the ocean is a place of particular interest to me coming from an island like Jamaica. And because it's fraught. I remember seeing Sonia Sanchez reading in Jamaica on a stage, the South Coast, and she just started bawling. She was about to start her reading, she just started bawling. And she turned and she said, that ocean behind me, I can never trust it. Because so many of us came this way, that way, right? And so for me, as somebody born in Jamaica, I was born a New Englander because everywhere England conquered was New England. So there's a way I feel a comfort here, but it's a fraught comfort. You know, the cod that fed slaves came from these waters, right? But I was christened in the Episcopalian Church, a Church of England. So when I'm here, the place feels familiar. The names of places, so many of them are similar. I'm gonna read another poem, a short one. It will not be scrolled. And it's a poem called Roots. And it's set here in sort of southern Massachusetts, Rhode Island. And it's another poem about water. And it's included in an anthology edited by Forrest Gandil and Norm Anderson called Water's Edge, which is coming from Northwestern University Press this summer or fall. Roots. Then the future was glaucomic. The bore through mangrove in the dugout slow. I recall the water in its color tannic. I see now an olive wake dissolving from the churn work of the screw. A time would come, it seems it has, to redecipher, understand again the meaning of the motor's open vowels, louding up a sacred space. Corporal Pitt, the bully, said something far beyond himself. You see all what favor frame for a madman basket? Those are aerial roots. He pointed and we took his reedy finger as command, us 6 good recruits, cadet acolytes joined for camping life, and paused I sweep for crocodiles. I plait time to those wetlands often. To be Black where I live now is to bivouac. White is wilderness in all seasons. I carry bankers of one sorrows, gods in a haversack of joy. Out on long log-sucking walks through marshes south of Boston, close west fairly of the Cape, I wink like to the look of bulrushes, how they call to Bible Moses, kind of favor sugar cane. Who resists the cattail's sorcery, such flirts? But the names, Little Massachuck, Sashewest, Sapawet, say them soft. No, shout these native names, names of the plowed near and housed to, the made margin, the salvaged by road, the done to as America tends to do with its indigenes. It's what it fails to kills. At water's edge, a man in waders arcs a lure, snaps it out for bass. Tammed women with clam baskets hunch against a pushy breeze in group leverage. Seashells smaller than the ears of newborns crunch in the wake of boots. My dry meniscus knees go skirch on pebble shoals. Sinuous chapel, festooned gaudy by ibis candle lit. I cite you, but how I could have no full conscious your low-key frieze of halophytes, the mangroves gazing wall of Afroed saints. I was just man youth. Once I pilgrimed to another coast of my island to be witness to in soul case by the final two uncaught, unkilled sea cows. Figures some were there, but as their wakes were, evanescent. They're gone now, like the Arawaks, as I too must go. I go home for now to Providence, comb-summed, bearded, chucking old bean boots, apparently adaptive. Ever hear? A root. Thank you.
Hello, and thank you so much for having this event. Thank you, Colin, for your beautiful reading. Thanks to Provost Locke and Professor Rose for inviting me to join in this amazing series of events. And also to my colleagues, Colin Channer and Erica Hunt, for being incredible writers and colleagues, and I'm honored to be here with everyone today. I wanted to start by acknowledging something, which is that I'm zooming in today from Tokyo, Japan, which, among many things, is the former center of the Japanese Empire. And I want to acknowledge something that isn't so frequently spoken about in Japan, but I want to acknowledge that I'm connected to this horrific history of Japanese violence in the Asia Pacific during World War II. There's a history of genocide, colonial occupation, sexual slavery, and all of these things are part of my history. I hold these things together at the same time that I hold tremendous joy and solidarity in the communities that I'm connected to in the US. They include Asian and Asian American communities, BIPOC, queer and trans communities in literary spaces on campus at Brown and elsewhere. I want to give a little bit of context to my writing and where I've been and how I've evolved over time. I grew up in white suburban America. I became a writer in the late 90s, was mostly interested in an experimental vein of American poetry. And the landscape of that was very white, but it was also a whiteness that wasn't so unfamiliar to me because I had grown up in white suburbia. In 2002, I moved to Japan, and in 2004, I published my first book. And in thinking about this event today, I looked back a little bit and thought about some of my earlier books that were that I'd written while in the US, coming from my sort of an earlier version of myself where I was or felt myself to be more fully assimilated into white dominant culture, even though my engagements with experimentalism in poetry kept me out of the cultural mainstream then too. Some of my books are explicitly feminist, and now I would look back and say it feels a bit white feminist to me. One of my books collects 10 years of love poems. It's called Hurry Home, Honey, and it collects 10 years of poems about loving white men. Kick that habit, but there's something in my past. I want to say also how much I've been affected by a book written by Dorothy Wong called Thinking Its Presence, which is a book that opened up ways to read experimental poetry by Asian American poets through a racialized lens, which was interesting to me because it even changed the way I read my own work. And the fact that even though I thought I had been more or less assimilated into white American culture, I wasn't as white as I thought I was. So these things have evolved over time. Over the time I spent in Asia, which has been about 15 years, mostly in Japan, a year in China, I had moved away from a racialized poetic orientation that is shifting in ways that are not so different from the ways that our American culture has shifted. One thing I see now and that I take great joy in is that I feel there's more space now for us to inhabit the poetic landscape without participating in an explicitly or a white-centric notion of poetry. And I perhaps feel this change vividly, partly because of my own ways that I've shifted and moved around these spaces. I'm thinking about a recent event at the Poetry Project where the Indian Singaporean poet Divya Victor had a book launch for her new book called Curb, but she invited other diasporic Indian poets to join her. And as they were each presenting, I noticed that some of them, a number of them, some of them middle-aged like me, were noticing that when we were younger poets inhabiting these very same spaces, that they used to be whiter and that there weren't as many others who looked like ourselves or otherwise. And also I'm thinking too about some things that Timothy Yu says. Timothy is a poet and a scholar. He's been teaching classes on Asian American poetry for over a decade now. And he talks about how when he first started teaching poetry classes or classes on Asian American poetry, he would have students who had read almost none, no poets, no Asian American poets. And now he was going into these classes where his students were rattling off names of people they had read of Asian American poets that they admired as they came in before they took his class. So in thinking about this, I wanted to share some poems from my most recent book called Some Girls Walk into the Country They Are From. I wrote this book. I started writing this book on the heels of the 2016 election, which also turned out to be a turning point in my own life. In 2017, I quote unquote returned to the US, which is more or less where I'm from. And, it was stunning. It was really a bit of a shock to return to the US at a moment in particular when it was being run by a white supremacist. And so race is always an undercurrent through this book, but I'm also thinking about what it might mean to write poems that inhabit an intersection of race and gender. I use the word girls frequently, I think maybe hundreds of times in this book, but it's partly tongue-in-cheek and partly functions as a mask. And so I will begin with a poem called Mountain Girls. People ask where I'm from, and I've no choice but to say that I'm from the mountains. And then, depending on the number of twitches I count on their face, I lie and say I'm from this mountain or that mountain in this or that state. The facial expression that leads me to fess up and say, I am from Awarezan, the mountain where desperately starving young men would carry their old grandmas on their backs and leave them deep in the woods to wither and die. Except that these old grandmas developed their own community of mountain hags and managed to live a grand old life, burrowing into the mountainside only when they were truly done with life, and not when some ungrateful, unresourceful son had decided to get rid of them. And yeah, I'm one of those mountain girls that is actually a reborn mountain hag. Well, that facial expression is quite wonderful and amazing, and I've yet to come up with a name for it. What about you? Where are you from? This next poem is called Girl Soup. And even though I say girl, I hold it as a placeholder, and I sometimes interpret that as a space where I can insert different kinds of identities. So just as an experimental mode of reading this particular poem, I'm going to replace the word girl with, for example, Japanese. Japanese soup. I get tired of being the one to make all the decisions. So when they ask me where I want to eat, I say that I don't care, I'd eat anything at this point. Next thing I know, I am face to face with a bowl of Japanese soup, and I just can't bring myself. Some of us at the table are in a hurry to eat the soup. They are specifically trying to eat the Japanese quickly because they seem to know that if you wait too long, they turn into cyborgs or robots, and those are harder to chew. I can see that some of the Japanese are still alive and perhaps would like to be extracted from the soup. But when I squint, I see that there are Japanese all over the floor with varying amounts of soup clinging to their clothes. You didn't think they were naked, did you? And so there goes that idea. Just at the moment, I think I've run out of options. Something comes over me and I take a deep breath and I do it. I jump right in there, that bowl of Japanese soup. No one is checking IDs or questioning my size or gender or race or voter affiliation. And I quick round up all the Japanese in the bowl into a large huddle. We have now obliterated two major problems. Huddled together, we are too large to eat. And also, we've taken care of the problem of the eater. I have to admit, I've lost track of the time. If anybody can cue me in a little bit, but I think I will pause there for the reading because I think we have plenty of time to converse later. But I just do want to say that this poem in particular, Girl Soup, is one that I find funny and reflective of the difficulty we have in dealing with the many, many problems that we're always engaging with. And so there's the problem within the problem within the problem, and thinking you found a solution to only find that that's still a problem is a little bit reflective of how I feel about our struggle right now.
I'm Erica Hunt, and I'm very pleased to be with you here this afternoon. I want to thank my colleagues and poets here, Colin Channer and Sawako Nakayasu. It's a delight to read with you. Thank you. I want to thank the organizers, Brian Meeks and Trish Rose. Also Megan and Hannah, thank you for organizing this event. I'm going to read a few poems from Jump the Clock and a few words about that. These poems in particular are taken from a collection called Veronica, a suite in 10 parts. It's a lamentation. So I've chosen some poems which are actually a sort of an examination of grief. I write poems to find out what I know. It's a kind of epistemology for me. I write to find out what I know, what I think, what I've experienced. And in this case, Veronica was my stepping into and finally sort of not as an abstract art project, but actually confronting Black womanhood, Black parenthood in particular in America at this time. So it is a lamentation, as I said. And I tried to explore different aspects of the lament as a form. This poem is called Upon Another Acquittal. It's a choreography of grief. It's written for Mamie Till, Sabrina Fulton, Samira Rice, and Geneva Reed Veal. Again, sort of stepping into my identity as a mother, Black mother, of adult Black children. She had needed to heal, but she had promised. Her blues angled, slipped out, capsized, traveled a long distance underwater. The sun cast a blurry silence, and looking, refused border. It filled her mouth with scorch. And when I saw her fall into herself, not her first grief, and crumple in an instant, knowing no justice will ever be found, could be found, where nothing is said out loud. And when it is said or wailed, the something said is something that no one else hears. Everything will be taken from you, even more than you know will be taken away, and it will sever you. It will make you swerve, stagger, as if punched in the heart or in a part you can't easily name. Talked over, punched into, so you pivot as if possible to get out of the way. I write as if words will suspend your fall. Gentle you, when there is no departing agony. A second poem, Morning Birds. Here 1,000 birds dispute the gun going off, the random backfire. Who handled who, and who rose to be recognized, and how the body came to be fresh, fallen there, and why the girl was tackled, and how her wrists looked slight in handcuffs, and the exact nature of the orange pin, and the load glassing her eyes, the load incalculable, and the incalculable load. Here 1,000 birds dispute the fresh blood on the sidewalk, the battle line, how it was drawn, how the sides were chosen. Had there been a trial and any doubt? And if so, how it was framed? Did the shot hang in the air, and who was there to hear it? And here, hold this thought, for a shot per day. As xenon follows its element or night, its daytime shadow, as penumbra fades into solids and endures a rain of blows, there falls a rain of blows. Here 1,000 birds dispute what went wrong, the stopped clock, the orange pin, the random call, the fall from childhood, the fall incalculable, the fall incalculable. This time to not let the familiar obsequies mask obscenity, twist lips. The birds dispute these two. These two, the televised worship of cinders is riveting. Junk heartache abetted by hollow gestures. The birds' disputations grow louder, frantic against glass, stunned, splintered, and hushed in shadow, honeyed innocence. The gun going off, the random backfire, appears as random as asking, who's got the gun? Who owns the gun? Who sold the gun? Who pulls the gun? And who does the gun let sleep? Lines on love's laws. What we do not dream, we cannot manufacture. Art follows ear and echo, covers, chooses, selective, eyesight searches the dust and is surprised by love's apophatic blinking. What love sees in daily light holds open color, ink, roar, melody, and quiet is its own steady gaze to better endure bumps. Always more song to be sung between the words. Jars memory and its subatomic, moving at the speed of thought. In random thirsts, rise, name the sensations. To fish for breath, combing through hair as tangled as nets, as thick as the beat of blossoms. A fine line between mind and senses spinning, in which her, my, their body becomes expert without waiting for unified theory, loving the body of one's choice, and to live so surrounded with fewer asterisks, more verbs, fewer security alerts, their eloquence before and above the grave. Thank you. Hannah, could you show this image? So this image, I have 2 or 3 images that I live with when I think about the possibilities that poetic imagination brings to thinking about race in constructive, productive ways, speculative ways. And this is a picture of, there's a custom among Venezuelans of African descent, but this is also common throughout the Caribbean and throughout the New World. There was a custom of braiding hair, as we know, but also of braiding beans and sometimes rice, oftentimes rice, into the hair. And this custom came about in the Middle Passage. People brought rice and bean varieties from wherever they were stolen from, and they braided it in their hair. You know, and I think about the investment in the future there. I think about what does it mean to think I have been stolen, I've been kidnapped, I'm brutalized, but as I go and as I love the people around me and I care about the people around me for which we have no record, we braid our hair with rice and beans because we see somehow, even beyond the current bleakness, the possibility of a future. I see in this image and other images that I do collect the capacity of people, even in abjection and who have a very lightless present at times, struggle. I also see the hope that the rice braided into hair represents. I think that when I think about the capacity of poetry and of Black poetry right now, I think that one of our responses to the present urgency is to hold the space for the possible and for the not yet. Anyway, thank you.
Thanks, everyone. This has been actually a feast, and a feast not because simply it represents 3 quite distinct ways of looking at the world in this period, but because the styles, the sort of, it's not just the subject matter that has been chosen, but the styles are so radically different in terms of their angles of attack. And you know, there's so much that I want to ask, and I'm going to throw out an initial question in lieu of questions coming from the audience. But let me, before I throw out my question, remind our audience that Q&A has been open all this time and is still open, and you're free to ask any one particular questions along the way. The question I want to really throw out for all three participants, and you may choose either all to answer or anyone to answer, is why these poems? You got this briefing from Trish, and I suppose from all of us, that we're going to do this session on race and poetry. And why these poems? Why not something else from your oeuvre? What led you to choose these particular poems? And perhaps we can start with Colin, since you've been off air for the longest, and for you to suggest, and then Sawako and Erica can jump in.
Thank you, Brian. I mean, for me, these are fairly new poems. I've never read from this collection before. So one, it was a good way of hearing the poems, but also to, these are lyric poems. These are poems about my life. And, I live in a Black body. I was born in a Black body. I live in a Black body. And going to dub music as an aesthetic indicator was something I was working on here. The idea of, cut and mix, of being, of finding reconstruction in the disaggregation of middle passage XYZ, but also to, that sea mammal, right? The way in which it's a blatant kind of metaphor in a sense, right? Of self-exile, and how something that can seem clumsy, right, in shallow water or on land, when it's in an environment in which it is allowed to thrive and flourish, how beautiful it is. It reminds me of swimming in the pool at Brown and being on the water. And there are very few brown people. And it made me think about the heritage of
brown faculty, but not brown people.
You're right, yeah, right. But it's a heritage of drowning, right? And the way in which, for example, it was a pseudoscience in times of slavery, the notion that Black bones were heavier and so would sink, and it was a way of discouraging Black people from trying to escape across water. And so
despite the fact that you, sorry to interrupt, but despite the fact that you invoke Melville, this isn't a white whale. No. You see, but the thing is that part of what being a free person is all about is that you can reference whatever, because Melville is part of my tradition. I mean, it's part of the tradition of world literature. But I was in the Berkshires on a fellowship, and I went to Melville's house, right? So Melville lived in the Berkshires, and when you go to Arrowhead and you look through the study window, you see Mount Greylock and you see the shape of the whale that became his obsession, right? So for me, I can pull from anywhere. The whole world is my inheritance. But using the aesthetic of dub to cut and mix, to bring together Melville with my own existential crisis, that was part of it. But going back to the whole idea of swimming, that simply not drowning, right, for me is a form of joy and resistance, right? I do not fear water, and generations of us were taught to fear water, and it passed from generation to generation to generation. So yeah, that poem, and then roots, about I go walking a lot, and to go again, to go by the ocean and just go wherever you feel like going because you're allowed. That is a joy, and that is a resistance as well. So that's why I selected those two poems. Thank you. Sawako, you want to come in?
Yeah, thank you for the question, Brian. I was thinking about how in a context like this, in some ways it's obvious to me that we want to hear more and more from Black poets and people who have been in the struggle for perhaps longer than I have or in different ways. But I'm also holding that together with thinking about, I love this essay that Audre Lorde wrote about what we learned from the 60s and how the thing to take from it, one of the things to take from it is how infinitely complex the path to liberation is. And when I think about that infinite complexity, I think about what each of us could be doing or might be doing to move in that direction, and how complex just the intersection itself is. And so what I bring to it is a feeling of race and racial orientation as not necessarily being fixed. And I want to move through that changing perspective. And I chose some poems that I think are engaging both these aspects of my thinking about the feminism and how I can use the tools that I've gained through years of feminist thought and apply that to how I can think about race differently or presently. And so the ways in which current experiences and current contexts can combine with some of the tools that I've been accruing over the years is something that moves into my decisions about poems and what to share and where to go with that.
Thank you. And Erica?
Well, those poems are quite obviously about race. And perhaps more obviously than is kind of typical of my poetry, which tends to look at the ways that language is layered and that we have different registers and we understand nuance and we understand meaning, but to me, I'm interested in breaking things up because it's precisely, some of the wallpaper part of language, the part that we assume we understand and know, that has put us in the present fix, why we don't seem to be able to break the lock of history. The poem Upon Another Acquittal goes back to Mamie Till, because actually the weeping of the grief of mothers, of Black mothers, been going on since we reached the shores. It's not a new story, but how come we can't break that lock, even though we have this other rhetoric of liberty and so forth? I'm also driven by this Adorno quote, after Auschwitz, no poetry, right? Is poetry possible? And I think about, well, then after such grief, what is poetry for? What does poetry contribute to actually the breaking of this lock, of this kind of cycle of violence and tragedy? So poetry is beautiful for itself. I love poetry for itself. It moves me. And also poetry is a way of extending the usual boundaries of imagination. And we desperately need a different kind of imagination. So that's the function of the blank in the last poem. The blank is, what is that? And the word apophatic, that word is like that $50 word. Apophatic means the existence of divinity where there is no proof. It isn't here. It's a negation. It's an absence. So really thinking about how do we suppose something that we don't have yet, which is the absence of violence against Black bodies, Black women, trans bodies. I, for one, have been writing poetry for 35 years, and I've been involved in struggle, I think, for 35 years. So I think, or before then, as a kid, these things are enmeshed. It's what draws me back again and again to poetry.
And Brian, can I add something to that? When Erica mentioned the idea of register, for me, I'm not an experienced poet like Sawako and Erica are. For me, it's a fairly new practice. But for me, I begin with sound and the idea of multiple registers in a poem of multiple languages. I mean, that carries with itself histories, right? And some of those histories have to do with the movement of people voluntarily or not. So in a poem like Roots, for example, in which there is a kind of American inflected English, as well as sort of middle-class Jamaican English, as well as working-class Jamaican English. All of these things carry with them a history, and knowing the history of that place, right? In other words, the sonics brings history. And for me, I begin with sound. Having a polyphonic, multivalent linguistic history coming from the Caribbean, and having had reggae sublimate Jamaican English and patois into poetry, I have this inheritance that I can draw on, and this inheritance is multiple. So you will see that in both of the poems that I read. It just happens to, because that is my life. I just a born so and I live so, right? Among and between languages and registers.
I just want to bring in another dimension here too, because we're talking about sonic registers, and Ayo Aborishade has written asking Erica to throw more light on the picture she shared. So visual registers are being introduced as both initially by Erica, now in the question asked by Ayo as to what to give more depth to what you've said about your visual image.
Just very quickly, it's an image that I think I first saw in a New York Times article, and then I've done subsequent research and seen and have discovered that it was not just Venezuela. They were showing it as a Venezuela, I'm very interested in the history of rice and Black people's cultivation of rice. So it really started that way. And I was then led to this picture and then to some other additional research that speaks to Africans who were kidnapped from the coast, from the West Coast, and were actually prized for their ability to cultivate rice. Mm-hmm. And brought to, for instance, the Carolinas, the Low Country in South Carolina to grow Carolina rice. Similarly, in other places, Dutch Suriname, there's a number of places where this, and in the Caribbean and in Venezuela, the folks were able to run away and start maroon communities. Colin, isn't that interesting? Using the rice that they had braided into their hair and the beans, the other seeds they had braided into their hair to basically sustain themselves as in maroon communities. I collect that image this is, my association. I think some people did jump off the boat when they saw that they were at sea and they didn't know where they were going and they lost heart. And some people put rice in their hair because they didn't know where they were going, but they knew that they were going to thrive. And to me, that is, neither is right or wrong. It is just human. I hope that gives some depth to why I collect those images.
Thank you. Ethel Barha asks of Sawako, thank you for such inspiring reading. The question is for Professor Sawako. While commenting your poem, Some Girls, you mentioned the entanglement of solutions and problems. Could you elaborate more on this idea? Many thanks.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I want to try to think about that in combination with a couple of things. I'm thinking about it, what entanglement is, what structures we're entangled in, what solidarity might mean, what institutions are in the context of poetry. And I think that one thing I might mention is that the book that I read from was written in a moment when I was transitioning from being outside of institutions or American institutions, certainly of the kind that I belong to now. And what that shift was interesting to say the least, partly because it feels like some kind of, excuse me, some kind of a success or an arrival to get a job or to be recognized as a poet, to have a publication. These things are positive at the same time that they take away from a possibly wider view of what poetry might be in the world and what poetic engagement, what translation, what and maybe even scaling that even wider, what point there is to engaging in poetry in the first place. And by that, I mean, I think about, and I think as an educator, I think often about the teaching of poetry, not only to help students write better poems per se, but to think of it as a training of the imagination and a training of being human in the world in a way in which we might take our poetic thinking, apply it or translate it to other contexts that may or may not be literary. And so in a way, by when I began this job at Brown in 2017, I was gaining something, and at the same time, I was joining something that is also entangled in the larger problems of our society. And so I'm navigating what that means in terms of my own work, in that some of my books I want to publish with presses are acknowledged and, you know, established, and that give me some kind of credibility and legibility in the poetic community. But there are other works that I think are coming from a different place and speaking to a different place. I have another book called Mouth Eats Color that I think of as my punk book. I self-published it in a completely roguish way. And I was, you know, trying to move away from conventional ideas of authorship, of translation or production. It's an ugly book in many ways. And I want to hold these things together. One other example that I'm thinking about a lot these days is the work that Mark Nowak does with his Worker Writer School. And during the pandemic, they published a book called The Coronavirus Haiku Anthology. And to me, it was a really fascinating translation of the concept of a poetic form that comes from my culture, the haiku. Most of my life, I've seen Japanese poetry appreciated from the West in a generally Orientalist way. But when Mark started using haiku with his group of writers who are domestic workers, they are taxi drivers, they're unionized, they come together, they write poems with them once a week, and they write haiku. And to me, that brought over some aspect of haiku as a poetic form that exists in the culture outside of the specifically designated sort of separated space of established artists. And it's something that everyone does. You see, I'll pick up a bottle of tea and there's a haiku that somebody wrote that's part of that packaging. Or I'm in a bus station and there's some public service announcement that's written in the form of a haiku. There's a way in which it's infiltrated the culture. So I'm thinking about the different ways that poetry can inhabit space and inhabit culture. And I want it to move away from the very specifically organized and lauded ways, and to bring it to larger spaces of thinking and being with language.
Well, thank you, Sawako. To follow up on your comment about institutions being entangled in the larger problems of society, a memorable phrase from your comment a while ago. Andrew Colarusso writes this probing question. He says, "This was beautiful. Thank you each for sharing the brilliance of your souls and minds. As faculty in the Literary Arts Department since 2015, who cannot vote at meetings, who cannot take sabbatical, I understand how institutions benefit from Black labor while also maintaining marginal positions. As a Black poet and writer who was paid $235 for a novel that took 3 years, I also understand how publishers profit from and marginalize authors of color. My question is, have you all experienced this from other artists of color? How do each of you deal with this kind of behavior in artists of color? How do each of you deal with these hurts, with those hurts? How are bonds of solidarity among artists of color substantively formed within institutions? Well, that's not one question, that's a number of questions, but I think we get the drift. Would any or all of us care to comment?
Well, yeah. This is I know that I will speak for myself. It's been very important to me. I'm a latecomer to the Academy, and I stayed away for a reason, because I was interested in understanding and rooting my sense of the value of poetry and of the work that I do, and of working in communities of poets in ways that did not, have to play by the rules of the Academy. And there are rules here. I would say that, one of the important experiences for me, I've been a member of many poetry communities, and they are actually much more essential. They have been well springs. They have fostered my creative work. So the work is valued in those poetry communities, and that's very important. Cave Canem, which is an important place for Black writing, and that in the last 20 years. The Poetry Project in New York, very important as an early poet for me. Language poetry, that was an early place of importance, was an important place of support, and just conversation and dialogue. It's the poem, the work of poetry is not identical to the work inside the Academy of Teaching Poetry. Yeah. The work of poetry is not the market either. That's one of the interesting things. There's no money in or there is now, but it's not about market valuation. It's like, where does one get a sense of value? And as an artist, you need that. And it has to be with peers or a community in a dialogue that means something, where the stakes are clear and are not necessarily the same stakes that exist inside the university.
Well, thanks for that. And it's a difficult question, particularly as an intra-departmental question, given that all three people here are in the same department. So I'm going to spare you having to drag this out, in this particular forum. Certainly, to riff off Erica's points. The Academy demands, certain rules which appear to be A, written in stone, and B, to be objective. And all of us know that they're never quite written in stone, and they're seldom objective. It doesn't mean that as Erica said, that we can function without rules of appointment, rules of promotion, rules of demotion, perhaps even. But it's a complicated playing field, and there are so many exits in and out of it, which don't appear on the normal roadmap. that it can sometimes, be downright unfriendly and at other times, clearly biased. So, we can't answer the questions posed by Andrew here, except perhaps to say that in the world that we are trying to create, that is represented by this conversation on race and poetry, and this conversation of race and in America today, we would hope that we will be moving to a better place with all of the distinctions and caveats that Erica has introduced, that there's a distinction between the academy and good poetry, or bad poetry, that the two are not necessarily the same thing or in the same space at all times. So, absolutely.
Yeah, sure. I mean, there are a couple of things, right? Is that being a writer is, in many ways, a matter of self-selection, right? There's no draft for being a writer, being an artist, right? At the same time, there is a privilege in being an artist of any sort, who, for even some amount of time, has the security of institutional support. We're having this conversation in an Ivy League school. So let us ground ourselves in that, right? That we have 4 people of color on screen discussing poetry. Now, I think that writers can belong to many different communities, as Erica said. And one of the most significant changes in American poetics the last 20 years has been the emergence of institutions outside of the academy that have worked to produce and sustain writers, such as Kundiman, such as Vona, such as Kabe Kanem, and there are many others, right? There are events like Furious Flower that create community. So what we've seen in the last 20 or so years, and this is to the chagrin of many writers, the amount of people of color positioned, right, within the academy, but also when you look at, the National Book Award, you look at the Pulitzer, you look at, once upon a time, you would not see any people of color. And sometimes, it may have been one. So there's that, right? At the same time, right, the larger questions of equity, I think, posed by the question, are questions faced by people who are train conductors for New York City Transit, right? And that inequity is baked into the system. However, I think in the case of the literary arts in the wider scope, right? I think the question is being discussed in the context in which there is no, there's no supply issue. In other words, if there is a field in this country and in this world in which, questions of, departments being not particularly diverse in terms of not just race, but aesthetics, right? Sort of age range, just being almost all American in a big international university. These are questions that are being posed in the context of, we cannot claim that there is a supply issue. As we say in Jamaica, you have poets and writers of color to stone dog, right? Right? So what then is the reason that we have here on a panel 3 poets of color with, among us, perhaps 20 books, and all of us are assistant professors? I don't know, right? I don't know. I don't have the answer, right? What is comforting, however, is that we're having this conversation in the context of being at a stellar department at a stellar university in an event supported by the office of the provost, right? And so there is certainly an awareness of institutional support, right, for the arts in general at Brown, but also, you know, difficult and complex conversations about, among other things, race.
Thank you. Sawako, you were going to say something.
I just wanted to add one thing. Thank you all for being so gracious and thoughtful about all of these matters. I keep going back to the line in Andrew's question that says, how do you deal with those hurts? And I think that it's so real. And my answer is a little bit similar to Erica's in the sense that there are multiple communities that we draw from. And the poetry community is a huge part of my life. And it's huge and it's complex and it's racially complex. My job at Brown is a huge part of my life. And it's, you know, as wonderful as it is complex. But in terms of how I deal with those hurts, I think about how, you know, our department is small. It's a little bit like a family in certain ways, but I also have a family that is 100% ethnically Asian. And that's the family I go home to every single day. All four of us are some combination of Japanese or Korean or Japanese, Korean, American, what have you. They're complicated. And it helps to have multiple spaces that we connect to, that we belong to. We have working lives, we have artistic lives, and we have personal lives. They are all intersecting, but they give and take different things in my life. And I think that without my family, it could have been a difficult thing to deal with the complexities of race as I returned to the US in 2016. And that's not the solution that works for everybody, but you know, we have various kinds of choices that we make as we find our way through poetry as art, poetry as industry, poetry as pedagogy, and all of these things have different modes in which we have choices. So that's how I deal with it. I think hurt and pain and struggle are real, and I want to acknowledge that.
So, Sawako, you know what I do?
What?
I just bawl.
I just walk the beach, right?
I just go on the beach and I cry and I work. And I talk to my friends because, again, this is not something unique to the arts. I mean, talk to anybody who works at in fast food. You know, I mean, these are questions that come up. You know, this the larger issues of equity, right? Run through life, right? And I think the coping question is one in which, again, when I feel I need to cry, I cry. I also laugh a lot, right? And I also get into the work because I am here at Brown because a hobby turned serious and worked out, right? There's a singer from Jamaica called Chronix, and he has a song called Likes. He says, I do it for the love, I don't do it for the likes, right? So loving it and remembering why I love it and staying in touch with that love is something I find sustaining, and laughter.
Yeah.
You know?
I don't know if we've answered Andrew's question, but you know, we want to thank him for putting it on the table as a very serious, general question that constantly needs to be readdressed and ultimately answered as part of ongoing questions of racial equity, but also equity in general, which need to be constantly put on the table. Now, the next question up on the list is from, we've been answering it, but let's state it anyway, and then maybe we can get back to it through Tim Lord's wording, which he says, how specifically is writing and reading your poetry part of healing for you? And can it be for more and more people? Okay, so he's basically asked the question that we've already got into through both Sawako and Colin, but perhaps we can think about it more consciously. Is this a process of healing? Is it a catharsis to write, or is there something beyond that we want to think about? Erica, maybe you can start if you wish.
Yeah, I think that's one of healing is just, for me, is just one of many possible activities or results or outcomes of writing. It seems to me that writing is, again, a way of thinking through things, thinking through experience. What just happened? What has been happening in the world? How do I make sense of it? How do I parse it? Can I imagine talking to a friend about it? Can I imagine talking to myself about it? But I also think it's a way of, and that thinking process is quite complex. Poetic strategy, for instance, reframes the ordinary and makes it strange. It makes something that's very typical and common that we would not otherwise notice. And it makes us look again at this ordinary event. So this decentering, reframing, making strange the ordinary, the act of eating soup in Sawako's poem, something we do without giving it much thought, it's been made strange. And so now we're thinking about both eating soup, but also being in the soup. And also, what is it meant, and the interchangeability of girls to Japanese, all of those words which are ordinary it seems that we're being brought anew to it. I think poetry is sometimes about difficulty and about slowing us down. And sometimes the slowing down and the really looking at something carefully, the attention that we give is also an important part of poetry's function. One more thing. I'm very interested in the idea that the thing that we would throw away or that seems to be silent and to yield no information can actually yield information and knowledge. It's knowledge building. Poetry is knowledge building for us, for the writer and for the reader. And so the throwaway, the thing that would be discarded, poetry says, look again at this and see if what of value can be discovered there. And I'm going to pass it to my colleagues because I know they have.
I just wanted to comment on the last line. I think it's the last line in Morning Birds, which stuck with me, in which I think epitomizes that point, where you say, "Who does the gun let sleep?" Who does the gun let sleep? It's not just what does the gun do. What it allows not to be done, the inverse of that. And I thought that was an extraordinarily powerful illustration of the point that you just made. Who does the gun let sleep? But Colin, you left the room, and I'd probably allow Sawako, if he wishes, to take it up. But the question on the table was, is writing and reading your poetry part of healing for you? And Sawako, I don't know if you want to maybe comment.
Yeah. Well, I was going to say that I'm not quite sure if it's so much a matter of healing, but it is definitely a mode of dealing with particularly the aspects of life that are somehow inarticulable in normal, acceptable, polite, appropriate language. And that there are so many things that we reckon with. Sometimes I was thinking about the end of your poem, Erica, where you have all these blank spaces and there's a way in which that poem, for me, the way I read it is a combination of speaking directly to things, but also speaking and articulating an inability to speak, and that becomes part of the poem for me. And I didn't read some of these other poems that are in my book, but I do write in altered versions of the English language. Sometimes I'm distorting the language, as almost trying to get as far away from as possible from legibility, and part of those modes of stretching away from polite conventional language is a mode of my responding to conditions or circumstances that are just beyond what I want to contain within polite civil language. At that point, it becomes a little bit more in an animal space or more in an embodied space, that I'm inhabiting language as a creature, as a human animal, and that my language, it also comes from my background in music too, and thinking about sound and how the borders of sound and semantic content are very interesting to me because it has a capaciousness. And do these things heal? I don't know, but I recognize that it's part of my dealing. And one of my hopes is that it makes a little bit more space to be with language and to be making poetry at a time when there's so much that is impossible to reconcile. And poetry is a space where I can inhabit that very irreconcilable state of things.
Reading poetry is more healing to me than writing poetry. I don't ask poetry to do that for me. Because one is that I can read better poems than I can write, right? So there's that basic thing, right? What is healing for me is when something I write is recognized by editors whose taste I trust. Then I go, okay, all right, okay. But otherwise, I can write without recognition just for myself, but it's not something that I don't put that pressure on poetry for myself as a writer. But as a reader, I put pressure on other poets to write great poems that can transform my life. And there are poems I turn to over and over again, poets I turn to over and over again. And that's how I experience it.
Okay, so we're down to 4 minutes before our time is up. And my great plan, hidden from all beforehand, was to get each of you to read a poem before the end. But we're like down to the wire. So what I'm going to suggest is that if you want to have a last word or read a really short poem that encapsulates any feeling you have coming out of this, then you're on the floor to so do, but it doesn't have to be a poem. And you don't have to say anything either, but I'm kind of insisting that you try. Erica, yeah, go. You need to unmute though. Yeah, I thought you were gonna go. No, okay, no, I'm not chorusing at all.
I'm a long-winded person. So I'm not the person.
Yeah. So any final comments from any of you? Okay, so let's not force it. It's been a remarkable 90 minutes really of a quite unique experiment for this kind of forum, which is to say, let's put race and poetry on the table. Let's put them together and let's see where it goes and how it goes. And I think we've had some really interesting work, obviously, but also what's been most interesting to me is is this soup. You know, to use Sawako's metaphor, this particular soup of Colin Channer, this sort of diasporic Jamaican poet. He describes himself as born in Jamaica, educated in New York. Sawako, who is a sort of migrant American Japanese poet who is operating between different spaces and trying to understand it. And Erica, who is grounded in African American traditions, but also with her own, I mean, if you read her biography, her own diasporic driftings coming to the table, and each of them approaching the question of race in America from their own unique perspectives. It's been quite a journey, and a journey which anyone who has been listening can return to via the poems which are going to be available in the recording of this session, but also via the more expanded works of our three guests today, which are available in various formats. And as you know, books, you can actually literally buy their books if you wish, as opposed to just it being available online. So and of course, all three of our presenters today are in the Literary Arts Department in various capacities at Brown University. And we're just lucky to have them and many others with us. So again, Colin, Sawako, Erica,
Thank you for having us.
for this
Thank you.
tremendous
Thank you so much.
piece.
Thanks so much, everyone.
And you know, once finally again to the team, obviously to Tricia Rose, the director of the CSREA, Rick Locke, our tireless provost, Megan Silvestri, Hannah, Ellie, and the whole team associated with this production. Our translators who have been doing a remarkable
Yes.
and
Thank you.
tiresome job, but tirelessly. We wish you that you will always be with us when we're doing these kinds of things. Thank you all, and have a very good afternoon.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank
Take
you.
care.
Good to see you.
Thank
And
you.
good to be
See
with
you.
you, to spend this time with you.
Definitely.